I want to talk about bathrobes, which perhaps you could have guessed that a little bit. But for the next couple minutes, I want to focus on those pivotal conversations that shape each and every one of us. And I want to show you how those moments directly tie to your bathroom attire. So I want everybody here to imagine the most important conversation you've ever had. This is the kind of conversation that dramatically changes your career path or defines your life purpose in some way. And I want you to think about where you were when that conversation took place. Now, if I had to guess, you're probably not imagining a space that looks like the one we're in today. The thing is, these conversations, they rarely happen in auditoriums, in boardrooms, or even in classrooms. But rather they happen around a bonfire or early in the morning, having breakfast with a close mentor. They take place when we're traveling and we meet a stranger sitting beside us on a train, or late at night out at the bar with friends, and they always seem to be organic and spontaneous and seemingly unplanned. And the ironic thing is that the most important conversations in our life happen in the most random of places. They happen in your bathrobe. So a few years ago, I had one of my own pivot conversations, which is what I've come to know them as. And I was actually standing in a bathrobe much like this one. And I'll never forget my wear. So I was a junior in college at the time. And I was in my college apartment, and I was sitting on the ground working on a Sudoku. And my friends were over in the corner working on mechanical engineering homework, which is most definitely where I should have been spending my time. And it was getting late into the night, and I received a text from a really close friend. And the text simply said, "Give me one reason you choose to wake up every morning." And I'll never forget this shiver that passed through my spine when I read those words. See, that friend had been struggling with severe depression and anxiety, and in a single text was essentially asking, "Give me one reason I shouldn't take my life right now." And I just remember, this stress and urgency that rushed through me, and everything seemed to fade away. And today, I don't even remember what I wrote back. But as everything seemed to fade away, I found myself consumed in the couple hundred characters on a tiny screen on my flip phone. And I found myself wrestling with this incredibly important conversation in a bathrobe and on my cell phone. And something felt really strange. And the first thing that got me thinking was the cell phone. Why was it that this conversation was happening in a text? See, I grew up on the brink of the online social network boom. And today our lives are completely integrated into these platforms, and we often take it for granted. And it often becomes the space where we sometimes have these conversations. But as we gain more and more digital connections, I wonder if we're beginning to devalue the in-person relationships in our life. We obsessively count over things like how many Twitter followers and Facebook friends we have, but when's the last time you counted how many in-person confidants you have? In 1985, which was 2 years before I was born, 25% of the American public had 0 to 1 person in their life whom they could confide in, who they could have a pivot conversation with. Fast forward to 2011, and that number rose to 53%. So let that sink in. Over half of our country has hardly anyone with which to confide in on the most important issues in life. Sure, living in this digital world has allowed us to grow in breadth, but I'm wondering, have we begun to sacrifice depth? Which started to get me thinking about this bathrobe. What technologies allow us to do is create these refined and polished versions of who we want the world to know us as. But the thing is, pivot conversations never happen refined. They always happen when we're our most raw, authentic, and transparent self. They happen when we're wearing nothing but a bathrobe. And I call this having a bathrobe mindset, being authentically and transparently, completely ourselves at the core. See, for me, my pivot conversation was actually sparked in a text, but it was over the coming years of going out to lunch at random burger joints, or driving down highways together, or playing way too many games of Settlers of Catan, that really allowed that conversation to grow in immense depth. And if it wasn't for the fact that we were face-to-face and vulnerably honest with one another, we couldn't have reached that point. And so as our conversation began to spiral into these random places in my life, I began asking the question, is it actually possible to design spaces that increase the likeliness of a pivot conversation happening? And I found that it is, and I want to share a little bit of what that looks like with you here today. So I run a group called the co.space, which on the outside looks like nothing more than any other home. But on the inside, what we're attempting to do is redefine what home is. So we take driven college students and experienced young professionals who all share a deep passion in doing good in the world in some capacity. And we invite them to live under one roof for at least a year and see what happens. So 20 of us currently live here in the State College property, which is the flagship of a much broader global network of homes that we're working on creating. And what we found is it's actually this amazing hub for pivot conversations. And there's 3 critical ingredients to make this happen. So there's the space, the tribe, and the intention. And space is actually the easiest of the 3. So space has this amazing effect on us that we're typically completely unaware of. You know, it's little things in our lives that we pass by that spark curiosity and creativity and inspiration. In our house, we try to do this pretty tangibly. So we have a water place rather than a fireplace. Or rather than your traditional tile shower, we've got a cave shower with stalactites and a waterfall down the back. You know, but at the end of the day, a space is nothing more than a shell, and it's a shell in which people congregate. And the real magic happens within that group of people, within that tribe. You know, so often when we talk about changing the world, you know, we think that the first step to make positive, radical change is actually about gaining experience, or gaining a reputation, or gaining money, or resources, or all of these things. But at the end of the day, the first step is always about finding your tribe. You know, it's pretty simple. If you want to have conversations that matter, surround yourself by others who want to as well. Which ties to the third part, which is intention. So we're creatures of habit. So we resort to having conversations that are safe and the norm and expected. You know, we talk about the latest season of The Bachelor or The Voice because we think that's what's expected of us, especially in our home. But take a second and think about the last time that you were on a retreat. And think of the type of conversation and experience you had at that retreat. The difference is largely your intention. You know, you enter a retreat expecting to have a different kind of experience. And we can do the same thing in our home, and it often comes down to just being clear about what our intent is. You know, we can do this by plastering that intention literally on the walls of the home itself. You know, I found that people are so hungry and are yearning to have conversations that matter, but they're often afraid to initiate or host them. And what all of us here can do is have the courage and be intentional about hosting those conversations, which gives people permission to join in. You know, by far one of my favorite parts of my job is the interview process. You know, we get to grill people that want to live in this home. And one of my favorite questions that we ask is, what's your deepest fear? And hands down, the most common response is loneliness. You know, people fear being alone. And I've found that this fear actually stems from a much deeper place. It's a fear of not having a tribe who we can engage with as our authentic self on a regular basis around things that actually matter in the world. You know, when you talk about changing the world, it's so easy to conjure up this idea that only superheroes are capable of tackling such things. But my challenge to all of you here is the next time you start thinking that way, to drop this mental Superman cape that you think you need to be wearing, and to rather put on the authenticity and vulnerability of a simple bathrobe, and you'd be surprised what can change the world. Thank you.